Merchants of Milan, Book 1 of the Nightfire trilogy, and Book 2 and 3 on their way. And this is my lovely sweetheart, Joanna, and has it been 21, 22 years?
22 years this
22
July.
years.
Actually, it'll be 23 years this July.
Oh my goodness, how time flies.
Yeah.
And I'm Melody Romeo, owner-operator of Driving Edge Transport, LLC, bringing food products to a warehouse near you. I'm excited to be with you today on Jori Loves a Story to answer some questions that Jori prepared for me. Now, these are in-depth and complex questions, so bear with me while I try to give you the very best answers possible. Our first question reads, Jori asks, how did your mother's passion for the Renaissance and Da Vinci redirect itself into a personal pursuit of the man and the era in which he lived? How did her passion, therefore, inspire your own, and what has stood out in your mind to be key takeaways about his life as he has remained a constant in your life? My mother was a teacher, and when I was about maybe 10 or 11 years old, she purchased these two fabulous, really big coffee table picture books, one for Leonardo da Vinci and one for Michelangelo. And each of these were very expensive, and they contain like the complete works of the artist, plus biographies and histories, and in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, everything he ever wrote, all of his sketches that have been found and that people know about. I used to spend hours going through that book and was fascinated that here was this man who, hundreds of years before his time, came up with these ideas for things like helicopters and tanks and airplanes and all these different inventions that he had the mind for and the ideas for, but didn't really come into practical use for centuries afterwards. And of course, he was also a wonderful artist, and I admired that about him. My mother had the house filled with art and music, and learning was a very big part of my life growing up. And Leonardo has just stuck with me as one of those paramount figures in history because of his foresight and so many things that he was good at and capable of. And he's really been an inspiration. If you read the book, you're going to find out some interesting things about Leonardo da Vinci, such as the fact that he was an illegitimate child. And you look at some of the things that maybe would have counted against him, and yet he came from that and became one of the most outstanding men of his time. Question number 2. Da Vinci isn't a key character in Merchants of Milan, but he has an exoteric presence permeating throughout the story. How did you want his presence in the background of the story to give a more subtle impression of your audience? And what did you hope they would take away from reading a story inspired by him? Well, I was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci, and I was hoping that, well, one of the things that really I wanted to do was showcase some of his art, some of his inventions, learn a little bit more stuff about him. I think it also gives the story a lot of credibility. Yes, there is a made-up character who dons a mask and a costume and flies around the city. But I wanted to give it as much real background, as much realism as possible for a story of its type. And Leonardo did invent a lot of really fascinating things. And for her to just kind of take off on some of his inventions and take them a step further shouldn't be totally incredible. It is now time for me to apologize for this very boring background. I have been driving straight for like 2 days and had no time to do these questions, to do this video. And so I finally arrive where I'm going, and it's like super late at night, and it's dark, and it's too dark in the truck. There's not enough light. I tried that, and it just was horrid. And I'm at this hotel, and there's people going back and forth in all the hallways where there's nice little trees and stuff. So now I'm in this like boring room with this beige background, but unfortunately it's the best I can do, and I really apologize. But question number 3, how did you first want to show Florentina to the reader? Especially in order for the reader to not just sympathize with her position as the last relation of her father, but also as a woman who wanted to rise above his untimely death. First of all, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, Florentina is the protagonist. She's about 20 years old, and her father was an assistant of Leonardo da Vinci's, and he was an inventor, and she grew up learning all this really cool stuff, and in a very unique setting. Her mother died when she was young, and she was an only child, so it was just her and her father and his work, and, you know, you kind of get the idea of, like, Belle from Beauty and the Beast with the inventor father and that. But he gets murdered, and there's no one to carry out the vendetta except for her. And so she begins to devise a plan. And it takes her several months to do so. And in that time period, she runs out of money because her father was great at a lot of things, but keeping money was not one of them. And so she goes in search of a job. And she's picked out where she wants to be. It happens to be a rival house of the man that she's after. So, you know, we can help these folks out while getting our justs in. They're also located just close enough and far enough away from her enemy that it's just the right spot. And so she goes in to apply for this job, and she comes across as being very confident where her intellectual ability is concerned, very confident where her physical prowess is concerned. She's very athletic. She's very smart. She has tons of credentials. But when it comes to social situations, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to dealing with people, she's a little bit shy and insecure in that regard, because that was never something that she excelled at or learned how to do so well. So we see her coming in being very confident until she meets this beautiful woman, and then she's kind of like all tongue-tied. So, number 4. What did you notice in contrast of their personalities and their ability to transition through their mutual tragedies in regard to Florentina and Maddalena? What do you think is the reason they had more strength as a team than they had apart? Well, we're going to get more of the team dynamic in books 2 and 3, because book 1 really was building and establishing their relationship to start with, but we are definitely going to get more of that. There are romances in which there's love at first sight, like Romeo and Juliet. In a lot of other cases, there's an initial spark that is built upon throughout time as the two get to know each other better and feelings grow. And that's what happens in this particular book. Also, I have noticed in really good relationships, quite often, it is the case that either interests or beliefs or goals are the same for the two people involved. But the personalities, the strengths and weaknesses differ so that the two complement each other. And that is what we get with our protagonist and our leading lady, with Florentina and Maddalena. They both have similar interests and goals and beliefs, but they have very different personalities, and they excel at different things. So they really complement each other, and that helps them to work well as a team. Number 5. How did you approach the world building behind the series itself? What clues of its historical era and the spunky effects of its genre did you want the reader to be curious to see coming into a scene as the world itself was described? In essence, which gadgets and other devices did you know would be inclusive of the series 2? Well, first of all, the 2 gadgets that I definitely wanted to have in there were obviously the flying apparatus, the glider, and also the revolving crossbow. Now, this revolver crossbow thing, I really got an idea from the movie Van Helsing. And I always thought that was the coolest thing, that Van Helsing had this crossbow with this little revolver thing, and it could shoot a whole bunch of shots. And I always thought that was really cool. And Leonardo da Vinci had actually, one of the big things that he got paid the most money for was working on weapons designs and inventing new weapons and stuff. And one of the designs that he had brought before the generals and the people who had hired him was of this revolving cannon thing. It was like a whole bunch of cannons, and they could fire one right after the other, so you could get a whole bunch of cannon fire off. But it wasn't practical because of the weight. It was so heavy that it couldn't be moved. Yes, you could mount it on a castle, on a turret somewhere, but cannons are much better for assaulting castles than they are for defending them. And so the army wanted cannons that were lighter weight and mobile and easy to take to the battlefield and take to the castle and to attack and knock the walls down. And so it never really got made into anything. But a few hundred years later, the idea was miniaturized into the Gatling gun. Now, Florentina took the idea and made a crossbow that had a little, revolver thing that would shoot the bolts out. And I thought that was really cool. And, of course, the wings. Leonardo da Vinci invented a parachute, a flying machine, and they already had a parasol. And so she kind of took these three ideas and combined them. The flying machine that Leonardo had invented was a little bit too large to just carry around. It was bulky, it was heavy, it had a wooden frame, a heavy canvas for the wings, and she wanted something that would be lightweight and small and easy to move and operate for a woman, and that she could use for getaways. And so she, instead of using wood for the frame, she used brass piping, which would also make it easier to joint and hinge so that it could fold up like a parasol. And then she used silk for the wings, for the fabric, because silk is a very strong and lightweight fabric. So utilizing those ideas that were already out there, and plus this was a very inventive time. We went for hundreds of years where there was maybe one new invention a decade. And when the Renaissance hit, there was like new things, new gadgets all over the place. And some of them caught on, and some didn't. And so I'm sure that there were many, many things invented that, didn't really survive through history because, they weren't practical or somebody just didn't, kind of like the electric car. They got pushed out of the business by the competition. And so I think that those two really I had in mind from the beginning, and then I came up with more ideas as we went along. All right, ready for question number 6. When it comes to crime and criminal investigation, I'm thinking crime and punishment. When it comes to crime and criminal investigation, what surprised you the most about how there was a lack of investigative instincts in this part of Italian history? In your research, did you uncover when they first started to investigate crimes without always thinking a person had died of natural causes, as was the case in the first novel, Merchants of Milan? Well, it's not that they always thought that they died of natural causes, so much as there wasn't anyone whose job was to discover what happened. Now, they did have constables, and they did have city watchmen, which were more or less just keepers of the peace, people to patrol the street and kind of try to prevent crime, or if they caught someone in the act, if there were several witnesses, if there was obvious evidence that a crime had been committed, anything that didn't require a lot of in-depth investigation, they went ahead and pursued. In most cases, the courts were full of what we would call civil cases, where people were suing someone. Oh, you cut down my tree. You crashed my cart. You stole my thing, and I want it back. And so they would sue each other in court. But as far as investigators, what I had uncovered was that the first police department in Europe was Paris in 1667. Scotland Yard and American detective agencies came about in about the 1800s. And I know I was reading where Jori had mentioned that research that she had done, that Japan already had people whose job was to investigate crimes, which is very interesting. But you also have to remember that the Far East was ahead of the West in a number of regards. I mean, where do you think gunpowder came from? It came from China. So I don't find it surprising that the East was ahead in some regards to the West. Number 7. As you were quite casual about how the reader starts to oversee the relationship building between Maddie and Florentina, how did you want this friendship to build into something close to a relationship, but allow the reader to feel this was an organic shift rather than a relationship that was pre-planned? How did you keep things moving between them to feel like a natural progression of how they felt initially? Sky, would you like to answer the next question? Do you want to answer the next question, Sky? Let's see. Do you know? Well, I certainly hope it came off as organic and not pre-planned. Did I? Did it work? That was the intent. They met. There was a little bit of an instant attraction. Florentina thought Madalena was beautiful. Maddie thought Florentina was interesting. And then Maddie saw Florentina interact with her children. And one thing above all else, Maddie loves her children. She is a mother first. Those kids come first. And when Florentina was so easy and so good with them, and they really took a shine to her, then it kind of gave her an idea that maybe there was something there. And so Florentina began to see Maddie as more than just a pretty face. And I hope that it grew organically. There was one occasion. I mean, both of them were kind of thinking this in your head, because it was not the kind of thing that was talked about. And you wouldn't just go up to someone and ask or be presumptive or assume that, especially, in a same-sex relationship, because it was still really kind of hush-hush. Now, we weren't, and we're going to talk about this in another question, at a place where it was, you get hanged or have your head cut off or something, but it still was a little bit of a social taboo, and you don't want to just embarrass yourself, but it comes out that Florentina is attracted to women, and then Maddie's like, oh, wow, well, I am too, so maybe we can pursue this. And I hope it came out as organic and genuine. I'll have to let you be the judge of that. And moving along with the same vein is question number 8. As this is a historical fantasy, was it difficult to explore a close relationship between two women in the historical context of where this series is set? Or did you find other stories or facts out of history itself where their relationship fit within the context of what was previously known about the 16th century? Well, I had one critic complain because she was saying, well, it was punishable by death. They wouldn't have done that. But actually, in fact, Italian city-state of Milan, that was not the case. It wasn't until the Holy Roman Empire devoured Milan in 1532, and most of northern Italy as well, that sodomy was declared a crime punishable by death. So at this time period, it was, you could get excommunicated, especially if the church was upset with you about other things. But you got to understand how the Renaissance got started in the first place. And there's also a misconception about the term. And the underlying foundation of the Italian Renaissance was the philosophy of humanism. And this word gets a bad rap today and is quite misconstrued. But the original philosophy of humanism, as in the Italian Renaissance, did not deny God or God's importance at all. What it did do was to recognize the fact that God created man in his own image. Therefore, God created man as a creator. Therefore, man should not only, it's okay to create new and wonderful things and beautiful things and grand structures and sculptures and invent and explore and discover. It's not only okay, it's part of who we were made to be. And also, it's okay to praise man when he accomplishes something, because isn't man a creation of God? And if God made man, then man must be good, because everything God made was good. It says so in Genesis. So basically, they were saying, we reject the man is just a worm in the dirt who just has to suffer through until the judgment, and said, no, 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 no. We should be out there accomplishing everything that we were given the mental ability and the talents and the physical strength to do. And that was the basis of humanism. And that was the philosophy that spurred on the inventors and the explorers and the artists and the musicians and the writers and the sculptors and the architects. And put that together with the money of the merchant class, and that is where you get the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance was all about the revival of the learning of the Greek and Roman societies. And authors such as Dante and Petrarch, who were very influential in establishing the Renaissance and the humanist philosophy, which, and I wanted to throw this in, by the way, I forgot. Humanist philosophy was not anti-Christian. In fact, there were at least 2 popes who were self-professed humanists who served as pope. So it was not an anti-religious thing. It was just a pro-man thing, And so getting back to where I was with the Greek and Roman societies, they were re-establishing things that mathematics and science and medicine that had been lost during the Dark Ages, that people knew about back in the olden classical Greek and Roman times. But they did more than just bring back the learning. They also wanted to bring back a lot of the culture. And ancient Greek and Roman culture had no problem whatsoever with homosexuality and bisexuality. In fact, they didn't even have words for that. You just loved someone, and, that was it. There wasn't any, specification for gender. So that was something that every educated person in the Italian city-states would be aware of. And number 9. All right, we're coming along there. There's a scene shared between mother and daughter, Daniela and Agnes. Now, Daniela is the wife of the antagonist of the story, and she is really an example of what many, if not most, of the women's lives probably were really like. She was in an arranged marriage, and her husband ruled over her with an iron fist. So we would today say that she was kind of an abused wife. And she was always trying to be beautiful and, trying to please him, because that's what you were supposed to do. Your job, your purpose in life was to please your husband. And so she's trying to do that. All right, back to the question. I apologize. I just wanted to let you know who Daniela and Agnes were. Daniela and Agnes, which made me think perhaps Daniela was warning her daughter of the dangers of using cosmetics and hair dye because she had suspicions about the products not being safe to use. Was this your subtle way of highlighting how dangerous those products were in the past, of how sometimes life-threatening ingredients were more the norm and how innocent lives were in jeopardy? Absolutely. When I was doing research for this book, I found out, one of the particular websites that I looked at was entitled Dying to be Beautiful. And it was about cosmetics kind of throughout history. And in this particular time period, what was considered beautiful was to have the light blonde hair, to have light complected skin, and if you didn't come across, looking as white as a sheet all the time, then you really had to use these powders and cosmetics and things to make your face appear more white. And, that's kind of hard to do in an Italian situation where at least half or more of the population is of Mediterranean descent with a much more olive-colored skin and dark hair and stuff like Florentina has. And Florentina doesn't care how she looks. That is certainly not anything she's concerned with. But Daniela does. She's trying to please her husband. And so these powders, I found out, had lead in them. They had all kinds of poisonous ingredients. And so when I looked up the symptoms, and so what Daniela was really suffering from, we would today recognize as lead poisoning from the cosmetics that she had used over the course of many, many years. Also, the hair dyes were notorious for causing women's hair to fall out. And of course, you had to be blonde if you were going to be beautiful. Now, so Daniela was wearing a wig. And her daughter has started to use cosmetics and to dye her hair because, she's getting to be a teenager, almost to marrying age, and trying to be attractive for the young men out there. And her mother's, hair is falling out, and she wears a wig. And, of course, all of the upper-class women had wigs. Some of them decided they didn't want to dye their hair. They'd wear a wig instead. The ones who lost their hair had to wear wigs. And then the poor people got money for selling their hair to make these wigs. And if you were blonde and poor, you could supplement your income quite well, grow out a couple of years' worth of hair, get it nice and long, and then cut it and sell it to the wig makers. But she was noticing how she didn't feel well, and she had all these symptoms. And she had talked to other women who wore wigs who had lost their hair. And so she was really kind of concerned that maybe what she was doing wasn't really healthy. And so she was, kind of warning her daughter, you don't have to do that. You really don't have to do that. And I hope you aren't getting seasick from me having to hold this little phone in my hand because of my adverse filming conditions. Okay, here we go. Question number 10. Why do you think Florentina hadn't seen the challenges of being a masked raider before she started to undermine her enemy's business? Meaning, before she met those in need as the masked night flyer, she hadn't realized that sometimes in life not everything is as it would appear. And sometimes there's a gray space where you have to consider your own presumptions about how things work. How did you see her own bias and position changing as you wrote more instances of her actions as the night flyer? And this one, I can tell you, came straight out of my personal experience. I grew up in a middle-class home. Florentina grew up in a middle-class home. I grew up in a home with loving parents who education was important, and art and music and everything was beautiful. And Florentina grew up in a similar situation. I didn't really know until I left home for college and moved away. I didn't really know that not everybody had the same kind of home life that I had, that not everybody had loving parents, that not everybody had plenty to eat and wear, nice clothes, and, money to engage in cultural pursuits. I didn't know what the rest of the world lived like because I was in my little bubble. And my bubble got popped when I found out that, people had all these really horrible home life situations and things that they struggled with that I had never known. And Florentina didn't know. I mean, you're told, thou shalt not steal. Prostitution, bad. But until you find out that, these people were desperate. Maybe they were abused as children. Maybe they were abandoned by their parents. Maybe they're destitute in poverty. And this is all they know how to do to get by. And so you change, hopefully, if you have a heart, you change from this judgmental position of, right and then they're wrong and they're bad to more of a position of compassion for the person who is suffering. Question number 11. Women in your series are shown at different stations in life in the 16th century. How did you want the women of your series to reflect a truth about the path it took women to rise through the women's rights movement, to not only have their independence, but to have their voice and to assert the rights all women should have? Well, I do try to show women at different stations in the book. And it is true that 95% of all the women of the time period, pretty much their life consisted of being placed into an arranged marriage at a young age, probably between 14, 15, 16 years old, sometimes to a man they barely knew, sometimes to a man who was twice their age. And their entire life was spent more or less as his unofficial slave. And you cook and you clean and you sew and you take care of the children and you do everything that he wants, and that's your life. In Renaissance Italy, in the city-states, and of course it wasn't called Italy at the time, but Milan, Florence, Venice, places like that, women did have a few more opportunities than they did in Northern Europe, and a lot of that had to do with the affluence of the society. You actually had a middle class in those places that you didn't see. There was nobility and there was peasantry in Northern Europe, but in the Italian city-states you did have the rise of the middle class. And middle-class women had more opportunities as far as employment and even education. But it was the wealthy. We saw throughout history and throughout my research that in the Italian city-states, wealthy women of station, whether that was nobility or merchant class, they had more opportunities. Opportunities for education, opportunities for power and advancement, opportunities to run their own businesses. And Maddalena is in the prime position because she is a widow in a very wealthy family, and she pretty much can do whatever she wants to do. Now, Florentina is from a middle-class background, but also from an intellectual background, and the thing here that was unique was that the salons in Milan and Florence and the other city-states, the intellectual salons allowed women. And women could come and discuss and debate the philosophies and all this stuff. And at one point, Florentina has been asked, why don't you go to a salon? And she's like, well, because I want to eat and have a roof over my head. And I have to make money because I'm not independently wealthy. So I can't just sit around philosophizing all day. But we do see that in this situation, when you're at the top, you've got more opportunities. And when you're middle class, you don't have as many opportunities as the rich, but there are still a few more afforded to you. And then there's the servant class, and then there's the rural women. And I don't really have any rural women in the story, but I do have. Question number 12. What did you feel was the most challenging aspect of planning the trilogy and of having the Night Flyer at the center of the series? Well, at first, I was just going to write a book called The Night Flyer, but as I got into it, it got to be too long, and I, for one, am scared of really long books, and I stay away from them, so I figured, well, we'll just break it down into 3 parts for the 3 acts. And so the biggest challenge for me, I believe, was trying to make it all credible, all the inventions and the gadgets and the whole concept, trying to make it credible and believable so that you could read the story without thinking, oh, that's impossible, they could never do that for real. I wanted to make it something that you could see actually could have happened, something that maybe could have really happened. And I think that was the most challenging aspect in doing some of the action sequences. And now, wrapping it all up, we have a sneak peek at Book 2, Secrets of Milan. The Night Flyer had brought Florentina and Maddalena together, but now threatens to drive them apart. While Florentina searches for a mysterious underworld organization that has attempted to murder the woman she loves, Maddie struggles to deal with the danger Florentina is courting. Her brother, Alessandro, has become the most prominent merchant of Milan, but the Night Flyer uncovers a secret so shocking it could destroy them all. Secrets of Milan is the second book in Edale Lane's Night Flyer trilogy, a tale of power, passion, and payback in Renaissance Italy. If you like drama and suspense, rich historical background, three-dimensional characters, and a romance that deepens into true love, then you'll want to continue the Night Flyer saga. Look for Secrets of Milan, coming soon. I want to thank Jori so much. This has been great fun. I wish I could have had cool backdrops and stuff for my video, but I hope you have enjoyed it and that maybe I piqued your interest about Merchants of Milan. You can order it from Amazon. Love y'all. Bye-bye.